You just finished an amazing coaching session. I mean, your client had a massive breakthrough,
Oh, the best feeling.
right? They looked you dead in the eye. They made this rock solid commitment, and the entire energy in the room just shifted.
You can physically feel it when that happens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you write down your notes, you close your laptop, and you feel genuinely incredible about the work you do. And yet, statistically speaking, there is a massive probability that in about 60 days, you are going to be sitting across from that exact same person, having that exact same conversation.
Yeah. Trying to solve the exact same problem.
It is so frustrating.
It's the profound deja vu of the coaching and leadership world. The
Yeah.
themes are identical. The language they use to describe their roadblock is familiar.
Even the emotional weight of their frustration feels completely recycled.
It does. It really does. You realize you are just trapped in a conversational loop.
And when you are trapped in that loop, whether you are, an executive coach, a therapist, or honestly just a manager trying to develop a team, the immediate default is to internalize the blame.
Oh, 100%. You think, well, I messed up.
Right. You assume you failed. You think, maybe I'm not asking the right questions. Or maybe you secretly suspect a person sitting across from you simply lacks the willpower to change.
Which is such a cynical place to end up.
It is. But if you actually pull back the curtain on how human beings process and retain information, you discover this recycling of conversations isn't a moral failure at all.
No, not even a little bit.
It isn't a lack of professional skill. It is a structural biological problem.
That is the core of it, because the human brain is an extraordinary pattern recognition machine in the short term, but it is fundamentally unequipped to hold weeks, months, or years of conversational data in active working memory.
Right. Our brains just aren't built for that.
They aren't. Even the most highly trained, deeply empathetic professional cannot retain every subtle nuance of what someone said back in March and then cross-reference it perfectly with some offhand comment they made in July.
Let alone instantly surface the invisible psychological threads connecting those two moments.
Exactly. Sessions are naturally isolated events. We take notes, sure, but human memory is incredibly porous. We overwrite our own internal hard drives constantly just to function in daily life.
We are essentially asking our squishy biological wetware to perform massive longitudinal data synthesis.
Which is impossible.
Right. And because we can't do it perfectly, the client gets stuck in a loop. So how we bridge that massive gap between having a good session and facilitating real transformation is, well, that's the entire mission of our deep dive today.
I am so excited to get into this.
Me too. We are looking at a fundamental paradigm shift in how we understand human conversations over time. And we're relying on the architecture and philosophy behind a platform called Coach Oracle.
It's a fascinating framework.
It really is.
Yeah.
And for those listening, you can explore their framework yourself at www.coachoracle.com. And just for some context on where this actually originates, Coach Oracle is created by Business Game Changer magazine.
Right, which is an online publication entirely focused on game-changing business strategies and the leaders who implement them.
Exactly. And what is so fascinating about their approach here is that it doesn't attempt to solve a human problem by removing the human.
Which is the usual tech reflex, right?
Yes, the instinct in the tech world is always to automate the relationship, to build a chatbot that replaces the coach. But the architecture here is the exact opposite.
AI-powered pattern intelligence is stepping into this specific biological gap to hold and organize the data securely.
So the human professional can just be fully, completely present without the cognitive burden of trying to act like a human database.
That's such a great way to put it, a human database. Because to really grasp how an intelligence layer fixes this structural memory problem, you first have to take a hard, honest look at the software graveyard sitting on the phone or laptop of anyone who manages clients.
Oh man, the software graveyard.
We all have one. If you walk into any professional circle and ask about tools, you will hear a litany of customer relationship managers, billing software, scheduling platforms, habit trackers.
The list is endless.
But the glaring issue is that every single one of those tools is designed to solve an administrative problem.
Right. They keep the business running. They absolutely do not solve the coaching problem.
There is a massive conflation in the professional world between being organized and being insightful.
Oh, that is such a critical distinction. Say more about that.
Well, think about it. Scheduling apps ensure you don't double book a Tuesday afternoon. A CRM ensures you know when a 12-month contract is up for renewal. Payment gateways ensure the invoice clears.
Which are all functional necessities, obviously, for running a practice or a department.
Of course. But none of those systems make you fundamentally better at understanding the complex, contradictory human being sitting across from your desk. Efficiency does not equal depth.
Wow, yeah, efficiency does not equal depth.
Mhm.
You could have the most flawlessly organized tech stack in the world and still facilitate completely superficial conversations.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy. Think of the current software landscape as a beautifully designed, perfectly color-coded filing cabinet.
I love this analogy.
It is fantastic for storing paper.
Right.
You can instantly open a drawer and find the folder labeled Client X October 12th, but the filing cabinet itself is inert.
It cannot read the files.
Exactly. It can't pull out a piece of paper from October, hold it up next to a piece of paper from February, analyze the subtext, and tell you the overarching plot of the story inside. It simply stores raw material.
And that analogy perfectly highlights the critical distinction between data and intelligence. When a professional sits down after a session and types up their notes, they are generating data. They're capturing what was said, the goals that were established, the emotional tenor of the room.
It's just a static record of a historical event.
Yes. Passive data just sits in the folder. Intelligence is what happens when that passive data is actively analyzed, correlated, and interpreted.
Intelligence is the mechanism that makes patterns emerge from the sheer noise of casual conversation.
That's exactly it.
I mean, it is the ability to understand the profound significance of a single, seemingly throwaway comment made today,
Right.
solely because of its context within everything that person has articulated over the past 6 months.
Which a human brain just can't do consistently. Professionals have been generating mountains of raw data for decades. Notebooks stuffed with scribbled observations, gigabytes of digital documents, audio transcripts.
But the intelligence has remained locked inside that data, entirely inaccessible.
And that inaccessible data creates a very specific, highly vulnerable window of time that every coach, therapist, or manager experiences. I call it the moment between sessions.
Oh, I know exactly what you're talking about.
It is usually that 10 to 15-minute window before the client gets on the video call or walks through the office door. You are frantically skimming your notes from last week, trying to re-immerse yourself in their mental ecosystem.
You are desperately looking for a thread to pull on.
Right. You are relying almost entirely on intuition and adrenaline. You hope a specific phrase in your notes triggers a memory, or you hope you'll just catch a vibe when they sit down and ask them how their week was.
Which is so risky. That window is when deep longitudinal analysis should be happening, but it rarely does, simply because the cognitive tools haven't existed to do it in 10 minutes.
You function on a mix of memory and luck.
Sometimes you catch a pattern, but often you miss it entirely, and you default to asking, whoa, what's top of mind for you today?
Which immediately resets the clock and invites the recycled conversation.
Exactly. Coach Oracle operates as the intelligence layer designed specifically for that vulnerable window. And when you activate an intelligence layer over your historical notes, it reveals the profound, everyday human messiness that we are all exceptionally skilled at hiding from ourselves.
Which brings us to the primary mechanism for this cross-session pattern detection.
Yes, because one of the most powerful interventions anyone in a guiding role can make is to name a dynamic the person cannot name themselves.
It's vital to hold up a mirror to a recurring behavioral loop or a habitual emotional response that has become so deeply routine to the client that it is entirely invisible to them.
It is the water they're swimming in. But to catch those patterns, you have to see them repeatedly across a long timeline, which, as we established, defeats the human brain.
Let's consider a deeply relatable scenario. Imagine a client who wants to launch a new business venture. They state this goal clearly. In session 1, they are fired up. They want to launch a new service offering.
Okay, I can picture this perfectly.
You spend an hour mapping out the strategy, discussing the target audience, building a timeline. They leave the session energized and highly motivated.
And then session 2 rolls around, and they sit down and say, I spend a lot of time thinking about that service offering, but the market timing just feels a little off right now.
Which sounds totally plausible.
Right. They say, I really need to do more competitor research before I put anything out there. I'm going to delay the launch by a month.
And in the reality of that specific moment, to the coach, that sounds like a totally reasonable, prudent business decision. Market research is genuinely important.
So the coach validates that caution.
Naturally. But then the client immediately pivots. They say, but while I'm researching that, I had this other incredible idea for a different product.
And the cycle instantly restarts.
Yes. Hmm. Enthusiasm, planning, excitement, mapping out a new timeline, followed by another perfectly rationalized delay in the subsequent session. This exact loop can play out for 10 or 12 sessions.
And the crucial element to understand here is that the client is not lying or being intentionally deceptive.
No, not at all. In the moment, each new idea feels legitimately compelling to their nervous system, and each reason to delay feels genuinely valid and necessary.
Because each conversation feels relatively fresh to the coach just rides the wave of enthusiasm with them. Without a tool that can zoom out to a bird's eye view and look across all 12 sessions simultaneously, the coach might not catch on until 6 months have passed.
Or they might get a vague, creeping suspicion that the client is avoiding the launch, but they can't quite articulate the mechanics of it.
So what happens then when the coach only has a vague suspicion?
Well, they might say, I feel like you're stalling. And the client will naturally push back defensively and say, no, I'm not stalling at all. Look at all these incredibly valid logistical reasons I just gave you.
And the coach, lacking concrete longitudinal evidence, will almost always back down.
Exactly. They accept the pushback because their hunch isn't strong enough to override the client's current reality.
That is the exact failure point of the relationship. The intelligence layer changes the entire power dynamic of that interaction. It reads through the accumulated notes, surfaces the recurring themes, finds the specific phrases that keep emerging across different months, and tracks the emotional pivots.
It hands the professional, documented, undeniable evidence.
It moves the intervention from a fragile intuition to a grounded observation. The coach can sit down and say, look, I have noticed that across our last 8 sessions, every single time we get within 2 weeks of launch date, you mentioned feeling like the timing isn't right,
Mm.
and you immediately pivot to a new, unrelated idea.
Let's examine what the right time actually means to your nervous system.
Yes. The conversation instantly shifts out of the realm of debate. The client cannot argue the documented facts of their own historical behavior.
It forces them to stop defending their excuses and start exploring the underlying fear of visibility or failure.
But patterns of avoidance are really just the surface layer. Where this technology gets truly fascinating and deeply psychological is in contradiction detection.
Internal contradictions are pervasive in human behavior, but they are incredibly difficult for a human listener to spot.
Because they almost never happen in the same sentence or even in the same month.
Right. You might have a client who talks obsessively about wanting complete financial freedom. They bring it up constantly as their primary driver.
Okay.
But in a completely different conversation 3 months later, they express deep, visceral terror at the idea of raising their prices or firing a low-paying toxic client.
Or think about the executive who claims their family is their absolute highest priority. That providing for their family is the entire reason they push themselves so hard.
Oh, this is a classic one.
But if you analyze the data across a year of coaching sessions, they have never once mentioned setting a single boundary to protect their evenings or weekends. The data shows they only ever discuss taking on additional projects or traveling more.
Now, the instinct when presented with that kind of conflicting data is to view it as hypocrisy.
Okay, I'm going to pause you right there because this is where I think this technology could actually backfire if not understood correctly.
How so?
Well, if I'm sitting across from a client and I use an AI to cross-reference their statements and I say, you claim family is your priority, but your actions over the last 6 months prove you don't actually care about spending time with them, that is incredibly hostile.
Oh, absolutely.
It feels like an ambush. It feels like I'm using a machine to call them a liar. I would expect the client to immediately shut down or terminate the relationship.
Your reaction is exactly why human coaches often shy away from addressing contradictions, even when they do intuitively sense them. It feels like an accusation.
Right. It feels like you're attacking their character.
But the intelligence layer fundamentally changes the framing because it relies on the absolute neutrality of data. These contradictions are not hypocrisy. They are the normal, inherent human tension of possessing conflicting internal needs.
The desire to be a present parent is in genuine, agonizing conflict with the desire to be perceived as indispensable by a board of directors. Both feelings are completely true to the client at the exact moment they articulate them.
Precisely. Resolving those contradictions, forcing the client to sit in the intense discomfort of them, understanding the origin of those conflicting needs, and making a conscious, integrated choice is the gateway to real transformation.
But you cannot resolve a contradiction you cannot see.
Because these conflicting desires are buried deep in the texture of everyday language and distributed across months of transcripts, a human brain simply cannot correlate them accurately.
The AI acts as an impartial mirror. It removes the confrontation because it strips away the moral judgment. The coach isn't accusing the client of failing. The coach is presenting a mathematical correlation.
The approach becomes entirely compassionate.
You can say, I want to share an observation from our data. You speak with intense passion about wanting autonomy in your role. But the data also shows that whenever an opportunity for absolute autonomy is offered to you, you describe the situation as overwhelming and immediately seek out a superior to make the final decision.
I'm deeply curious about that tension.
Right. What comes up for you when you sit with both of those realities simultaneously?
I am curious about that tension. That is the magic phrase. It invites the client to look at their own psychology from a third-party perspective. It isn't a gotcha moment designed to make them feel foolish. It is a profound revelation.
Achieving that level of precise, non-judgmental questioning is almost impossible without having raw data synthesized into objective intelligence.
Exactly.
Speaking of raw data, there is one specific ritual in the coaching and leadership world that produces more data than almost anything else, and it provides a massive psychological window into the client. I'm talking about the ritual of the commitment.
Oh, the commitment. Yes.
Yeah. Every session, whether it is high-stakes executive coaching, personal therapy, or a weekly one-on-one with a direct report, tends to conclude the exact same way. The individual states a goal.
They say, this Thursday, I'm going to initiate that difficult conversation with my co-founder.
Or, this weekend, I'm finally going to sit down and update my resume. They write it down, you write it down. The motivation in the room is palpable.
And then they leave the controlled environment of the office. Real life intervenes. Tuesday morning arrives, the manufactured motivation has completely evaporated, and the task suddenly feels terrifying or exhausting.
By the time the next session rolls around, the commitment has quietly vanished into the ether.
Coach Oracle automatically tracks this commitment reliability.
Now, if you just glance at that feature, tracking whether someone did their homework sounds like a basic productivity metric. It sounds like a feature you would find in Asana or Trello. It feels administrative.
It does sound like that, yes.
But viewing commitment tracking as a productivity tool entirely misses the psychological depth of what is actually happening.
It is not a productivity metric. It is a behavioral diagnostic tool. What an individual actually executes versus what they confidently state they are going to execute is the most revealing data set a professional can access.
It's the gap between intention and action.
Exactly. If a client is flawlessly reliable with certain categories of tasks, for instance, they always complete complex analytical spreadsheets 2 days early, but they consistently, predictably drop any commitment that involves interpersonal conflict or setting a boundary, that disparity is screaming a diagnostic message.
It points directly to an unacknowledged fear or a deep ambivalence about the stated goal. But let's look at the inverse of that, which I find even more fascinating.
Okay, let's hear it.
Consider the scenario of the client who continuously makes wildly ambitious, almost impossible commitments. They sit in your office and say, by our next session on Tuesday, I am going to rebuild my entire e-commerce website, launch a new podcast, and do aggressive outreach to 50 cold leads.
It sounds amazing in the room.
Right. But they come back the next week and they haven't touched a single one of those items.
The standard professional response to that scenario is incredibly revealing of our blind spots.
A coach or a manager will almost always treat that as a time management failure. They will say, okay, your ambition is great, but you bit off more than you could chew. Let's look at your calendar.
Let's try time blocking. Let's implement the Pomodoro technique. Let's break these tasks down into micro steps.
Right. They treat the failure as an administrative logistical problem.
Which completely ignores the underlying psychological architecture of the behavior. Because manually tracking the success and failure rates of commitments across 30 different clients is logistically impossible for a human, professionals treat each missed goal as an isolated incident of poor planning.
Here's where it gets really interesting. When an intelligence layer tracks this automatically over a 6-month period, a totally different behavioral picture emerges. You realize the client doesn't have a time management issue at all.
They are using the act of making massive commitments as a highly sophisticated psychological defense mechanism.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. How does making a commitment protect you from doing the work?
When you formulate a massive, highly ambitious plan, your brain doesn't necessarily distinguish between the plan and the execution. Making the plan gives your brain a massive hit of dopamine.
So you feel like you've already accomplished something.
Exactly. In that moment, sitting in the coaching chair, you feel like a visionary. You feel incredibly productive. But by making the goal impossibly large for a 1 week time frame, you subconsciously guarantee your own failure.
And if the task is genuinely impossible, failing at it doesn't threaten your ego. You can tell yourself, well, of course I didn't rebuild the whole website in 3 days. I'm only human.
Right. It's a way to feel the emotional high of working hard while safely avoiding the genuine vulnerability of taking small, incremental, measurable actions where failure would actually sting.
Wow. Failing at a massive, unrealistic goal protects the ego. Failing at a small, easily achievable goal destroys it.
The ambition itself is the shield. And a professional will never see that shield if they are just treating each session as a fresh start.
If you do not track the commitment systematically, you are endlessly resetting the clock. You spend hours optimizing their calendar and suggesting new productivity apps, while the deep subconscious psychological avoidance goes completely unchecked and unchallenged.
The intelligence layer ensures that the history of a client's follow through doesn't slip through the cracks of a busy professional's memory. You walk into the session armed with their historical data.
You can say, I see you have enthusiastically committed to launching this specific project 4 times in the last 3 months, and 4 times it has been dropped entirely. I do not want to talk about your calendar or your task manager today. I want to talk about what is actually terrifying you about taking the very first step.
That is an entirely different caliber of conversation.
It really is. So we have spent a lot of time analyzing how technology catches negative patterns, avoidance, self-sabotage, contradictions, and dropped commitments. But the positive applications are arguably even more vital.
Oh, I completely agree. If tracking the failures is crucial for intervention, tracking the sudden leaps forward is essential for sustained motivation.
Yet, counterintuitively, the moments of greatest positive growth are the moments most frequently lost by professionals.
How does a professional lose a breakthrough? I mean, it's the entire reason they are in the room. It's the high watermark of the whole journey.
A breakthrough is lost precisely because the professional is executing their job perfectly in that moment. Consider the anatomy of a breakthrough in a live session. It is a sudden, visceral shift in perspective.
A piece of deep self-awareness finally clicks into place.
Exactly. The client articulates a truth they have been avoiding. The physical energy in the room shifts. Their voice drops. Their posture changes. They might look away or tear up.
In that exact, highly charged moment, the coach is not going to stop the conversation, pull out their laptop, open a Google Doc, and meticulously type, "Note, client just experienced a massive paradigm shift regarding their core belief about self-worth."
Right. Doing that would shatter the container of trust they've built. The coach leans in. They remain fully present. They hold space for the human being experiencing the emotion.
Which is exactly the correct human response.
But the administrative consequence is that when the session concludes and the professional writes up their notes an hour or two later, that profound, life-altering psychological shift gets flattened.
It gets reduced to a single, dry sentence buried in 3 paragraphs of other logistical observations. There is no flashing red light around it in the data.
Over time, as these tiny breakthroughs accumulate quietly, they become disconnected from the ongoing narrative of the relationship.
This phenomenon leads to what is perhaps the most profound concept we are exploring today: the invisibility of transformation.
I want to spend some time dissecting this because it applies to almost every facet of human development. Positive growth is so slow, so agonizingly incremental, that we become entirely blind to it while it is happening to us.
It is the boiling frog metaphor, but applied to positive change.
The pace of personal evolution makes it unremarkable from the inside. When you inhabit your own mind every single day, you do not notice the microscopic shifts in how you process stress, or how you communicate boundaries with your spouse, or how you manage anxiety.
You just feel like you. And more crucially, human memory actively overwrites previous emotional states. You literally forget the specific crushing flavor of anxiety you experienced 6 months ago once you have moved past it.
You completely lose touch with your own starting line, and this neurological quirk creates a massive crisis of motivation for the client. Think about the mechanics of how we measure success. A client looks at where they are right now in the present moment.
But they don't compare their present state to where they started because their brain has deleted the emotional memory of where they started.
Instead, they compare their present state to their ultimate, perfect, idealized future self.
And when measured against an impossible ideal, the present self always falls short. Consequently, the client feels like they are failing.
They start to wonder if the coaching engagement is actually producing any real results. They lose the kinetic energy that made the early sessions so vibrant.
In many cases, they quietly terminate the relationship, entirely unaware of the massive psychological ground they have actually covered.
So what does this all mean? The fundamental role of the professional, then, is to find a way to make the invisible visible. This is the exact function of Coach Oracle's transformation reports.
These reports don't just summarize notes, they retroactively scan months of conversational data, specifically looking for the linguistic markers of belief shifts.
The AI finds the exact language of realization that got buried in the notes, tags it, and pulls it out into the light.
It maps the psychological journey. It compiles a highly structured, undeniable summary that demonstrates the timeline of change. It shows the client, here is the destructive pattern you articulated on day one. Here are the boundaries you are now consistently maintaining.
And here are the exact words you used when your fundamental belief about your own competence shifted in March.
It compresses the entire arc of the professional relationship onto a single page.
The impact of seeing your own evolution presented back to you in your own words is immense. Imagine a client sitting in a session feeling deeply discouraged, feeling like they're spinning their wheels. The coach slides a report across the desk and says, "Look at this data."
6 months ago, you explicitly stated you would never be able to stand up to your business partner. Here are 3 documented distinct instances from the last month where you did exactly that, and here is how you described feeling afterward.
That is not a coach being a cheerleader. That is not empty validation. That is concrete, objective evidence of evolution.
It generates a depth of recommitment to the process that no amount of motivational speaking could ever achieve. But the transformation report also solves the hardest business problem in the coaching industry.
Which is proving return on investment.
Proving ROI in a profession built entirely on intangible emotional and psychological shifts is notoriously difficult. If you are an executive coach hired by a corporation, the HR department or the board of directors eventually wants to know what they're paying for.
They struggle to articulate the value of the ongoing investment because they can't see the internal shifts.
A transformation report provides a highly professional, data-backed answer. It proves that these sessions are not just pleasant, unstructured chats. They are a rigorous process that produces documented, measurable behavioral change.
Okay, so we now have a clear picture of this intelligence layer. We have the avoidance patterns mapped out, the internal contradictions highlighted, the commitment reliability tracked, and the breakthroughs systematically documented.
The ultimate question is how all of this compiled intelligence actually changes the real-time, minute-by-minute conversation happening inside the room.
And the answer lies in the fundamental engine of any deep conversation, the questions.
The quality of a coaching session is almost entirely dictated by the quality of the questions the professional asks.
Exceptional questions open up space. They create a highly productive form of cognitive discomfort. They force the client's brain to abandon its rehearsed scripts, bypass its defense mechanisms, and genuinely explore uncharted territory.
But generating those kinds of questions on the fly while actively listening is incredibly taxing.
Because it is so difficult, a massive percentage of the coaching industry relies heavily on templates. Professionals internalize lists of powerful coaching questions.
They lean on reliable standards like, what would you do if you knew you could not fail? Or what is the hidden opportunity in this specific challenge?
Those questions aren't inherently bad, but they are generic. They're one size fits all. They can be asked of a CEO trying to scale a tech company or a college student trying to pick a major.
And because they're generic, they trigger a generic response mechanism in the client's brain.
The client has heard variations of those questions before, on podcasts or in self-help books, and their brain instantly serves up a prepackaged, safe response.
Coach Oracle bypasses the generic template entirely. It takes the massive amount of compiled intelligence, the specific vectors of the client's language, their historical contradictions, their dropped commitments, and uses it to generate hyper-specific coaching questions tailored exclusively for the upcoming session.
It is building a query out of the unique contours of that individual's documented psychological profile.
Instead of a coach leaning back and asking a template question like, what do you feel is currently holding you back?
Right, which gets a boring answer.
The intelligence layer prompts the coach to ask something fiercely specific. It suggests you have successfully launched 3 highly creative projects this year, but the data shows you have consistently avoided finalizing the budget for any of them. What is it about financial finality that feels dangerous to your creative process?
Wow. If you ask a client that question, they cannot give you a rehearsed, PR-friendly answer. Their brain doesn't have a script for it.
They are forced to stop, sit in the silence, and genuinely think. It plunges them immediately into the deep end of the psychological pool.
And practically speaking, that accelerates the timeline of the session dramatically. If you analyze most one-hour coaching sessions, there's an extensive warm-up zone.
Oh, the first 20 to 30 minutes are often spent just catching up, reviewing the events of the week, trying to find a conversational thread, and figuring out what is actually important to discuss.
By the time the coach unearths the real generative issue, the session is half over.
Armed with hyper-specific, data-driven questions, you bypass that warm-up zone entirely. You spend significantly less time searching for the territory and significantly more time actually mapping it.
For veteran professionals, this technology acts as a world-class research assistant. It sifts through the noise, hands you the raw psychological material, and allows you to use your decades of human judgment to deliver the intervention with perfect timing and empathy.
And for newer professionals who are still building their intuition, it functions as an unparalleled training resource.
It models what deep, pattern-aware longitudinal thinking actually looks like in practice. By constantly seeing the connections the AI is surfacing, the newer coach trains their own brain to look for those same invisible threads. It dramatically accelerates their developmental curve.
We have spent the better part of an hour discussing the profound benefits of feeding deeply intimate, highly vulnerable human data into an artificial intelligence system to extract these insights. But doing so introduces a massive, unavoidable complication that we must dissect.
Yes, the elephant in the room.
When clients are sitting in a room sharing their deepest fears, their professional failures, their fraught family dynamics, and their financial insecurities, who actually possesses that data?
It is the single most critical question we can ask about the integration of technology into human development. The architecture of Coach Oracle takes an uncompromising stance on this reality. Privacy in the coaching, therapeutic, and leadership fields is not a feature you add on later.
It is the absolute foundational ethical covenant of the profession.
The entire architecture of the relationship relies on the client believing unequivocally that what is said in the room stays in the room.
The rapid proliferation of cloud-based AI creates a massive structural tension with that covenant of trust. When a coach takes their raw, unredacted session notes and pastes them into a mainstream third-party AI platform, whether it's OpenAI, Anthropic, or any other cloud service to get a quick summary, those notes are physically leaving the room.
They are being transmitted across the internet and stored on servers owned by massive, publicly traded tech corporations.
Most well-meaning professionals simply haven't thought through the long-term architectural implications of that action. They are just trying to save time.
But where exactly is that highly sensitive data going? Who holds the encryption keys to those remote servers? What are the specific terms of service? And how frequently do those corporations quietly update those terms to allow broader data usage?
What happens if that specific AI startup goes bankrupt and its data assets are acquired by a larger corporation with entirely different privacy standards?
Or consider the most prevalent fear. What if the AI corporation is actively using that highly sensitive proprietary coaching data to train its next generation of public models?
Imagine a scenario where a client's highly specific, confidential business struggles or their marital issues subtly influence the output of a public chatbot used by millions of people.
It is a massive professional liability. And frankly, the vast majority of clients have zero idea that their private confessions are being passed through third-party corporate APIs.
This is exactly why Coach Oracle's technical architecture is arguably its most important feature. It was engineered from the ground up to make the specific vulnerability disappear. Coach Oracle does not live on a third-party cloud server.
It is deployed as a plugin that lives entirely inside the professional's own WordPress website infrastructure.
The technical distinction here is absolutely vital for anyone handling confidential information. When the professional installs the system and asks the AI to analyze the patterns or generate a transformation report, that processing happens locally.
The semantic search, the vectorization of the data, the generation of the insights, it all occurs within the professional's own securely hosted server environment.
Let me make sure I'm clarifying this perfectly. No client data is ever packaged up, sent across the open internet via an API, and processed on an external server owned by a tech giant.
Zero third-party corporate entities ever gain access to the raw session notes. There is no external subscription model that effectively holds the client's psychological data hostage on someone else's platform.
The coach owns the intelligence layer the same way they own the physical filing cabinet in their office.
It is a radical departure from the architecture of almost every other AI tool currently dominating the market. Cloud computing is a default because it is exponentially easier and cheaper to build.
Choosing to engineer a local, self-hosted, privacy-first tool requires a deliberate, difficult architectural commitment. And for the professional, choosing to utilize a privacy-first tool isn't merely a matter of checking a box for IT security compliance.
It is a profound, demonstrable statement of their professional values.
It proves to the client that the covenant of trust is not just empty lip service. It isn't an afterthought buried on page 14 of a dense terms of service agreement that no one reads.
It is the core architectural foundation of the tools the coach deliberately chooses to employ. In a market where everyone is scrambling to adopt the newest, flashiest AI tools entirely, regardless of the privacy implications, a professional who can look a client in the eye and say, "I protect your data" at a structural, architectural level stands out immensely.
It deepens the trust, and as we know, deep trust is the absolute prerequisite for any real vulnerability.
We have covered a tremendous amount of psychological and technical ground today. If we pull all of these disparate threads together and synthesize the core message, there are four fundamental things that change for a professional when they integrate this kind of deeply contextual, privacy-protected intelligence into their practice.
The first profound change is confidence.
Confidence transforms the practitioner because you are no longer arriving at a session desperately hoping your memory serves you. You aren't operating on a vague hunch.
You have reviewed the longitudinal pattern analysis, you know the precise history of their commitments, you see the internal contradictions clearly mapped out.
You are arriving fully, completely informed, which changes your entire physical and mental bearing in the room. You are grounded.
That grounding leads directly to the second major shift, courage. We discussed earlier how difficult it is to challenge a defensive client when you only have an intuition. You hesitate to stick your neck out because you might be wrong, and being wrong damages rapport.
But when you possess the documented evidence, when you can say, every single time this specific topic arises, you redirect the conversation, and here are the exact dates of the last 5 times you did it. It requires significantly less courage to speak the truth.
You are simply naming a reality that is demonstrably real.
And that leads to the third, and perhaps the most beautiful change we've discussed, the client's experience of being genuinely seen. Every human being has a deep, fundamental psychological need to be truly witnessed by another person.
Not just witnessed in a single 50-minute window on a Tuesday afternoon, but witnessed across the long, messy arc of time.
When a coach can prove, with data, that they have been paying meticulous attention to the entire journey, it creates a profound sense of psychological safety. The client realizes, this person actually knows me.
From that foundation of safety, they take significantly bigger risks and are willing to stay in the discomfort of growth much longer.
Finally, the fourth change is the meaning of the work itself. The guiding professions, coaching, therapy, leadership, can be incredibly isolating. You pour your emotional energy into developing people, and because transformation is invisible, it is often hard to see your own impact.
Having an intelligence layer that actually measures and maps the transformation that makes the invisible difference visible sustains the professional. It proves to them that their work matters.
It provides undeniable evidence that human lives are actually changing trajectory because of their intervention.
That brings us to the final alignment of this entire philosophy. We started this deep dive by asking a massive question. How do we bridge the gap between having good sessions and creating real transformation?
The answer we've uncovered isn't to replace the human being with the machine. The answer is to use the machine to do what it does best, process massive amounts of longitudinal data so the human being can do what they do best.
The intelligence layer ensures the coach arrives with their eyes fully open, unburdened by the limits of biological memory, so they can be fully, completely present for the unpredictable magic of human connection.
It is the perfect synthesis of technology serving humanity, rather than technology replacing it. It provides a fascinating blueprint for the future of human development.
It really does.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We have spent the last hour dissecting the behavior of clients, the tools of professionals, and the mechanics of session notes. But turn that lens inward for a moment.
Think about your own life.
Think about the conversations you have with your partner, your close friends, your boss. If an intelligence layer could read the transcripts of your last 6 months of life and see all the invisible threads connecting your words and actions.
What patterns of avoidance, what glaring internal contradictions, and what silent, unacknowledged breakthroughs are you currently living out right now, entirely blind to them, simply because you don't have the bird's eye view of your own life?